Welcome to Alpha Kappa Psi's webinar titled Mediating Conflict, My Side, Your Side, and the Truth. This webinar is part of the Risk Management series. My name is Mackenzie Lauka, and I serve AK Psi as the Associate Director of Education. I will be your webcast producer. Before we dive into the content, I would like to review the web-based features available to you. This webinar will be advanced remotely, but at the bottom of your screen, there are multiple application widgets you can use throughout the program. I encourage you to utilize the widgets to download additional resources, connect with other attendees during the presentation, and share highlights via social media. A copy of the slide deck and other additional materials are available in the resource list widget that looks like a green folder. The group chat is available for you to interact with other attendees and the presenter during the presentation. When posting, it will share your first name and last initial, but be sure to mention your chapter or university as well. If you have any technical difficulty, please click on the Help widget. It has a question mark icon and covers most common technical issues. Additionally, each of the windows on your screen are also able to be resized, moved, and adjusted to fit your individual learning need. At the end of the program, I'll explain how you can ask a question to our panelists, but if you have a question throughout the program, you can launch the Q&A widget to submit your question. Your questions will be asked at the end of the program in the order they are received. Be sure to also check out our social media content. Portions of today's program will be tweeted using the hashtag AKSciChat. You can follow along using the Twitter widget in the menu dock at the bottom of the screen, as well as post highlights to your own Twitter feeds using the hashtag. You may also find some valuable resources on the AKSci blog, Facebook page, Instagram feed, LinkedIn page, Twitter feed, and our YouTube channel, each of which are available from the aksci.org homepage. The key to almost any business decision is negotiation. Most times, we have the benefit of examining the issue, conducting research, and engaging in well-prepared and productive talks. Sometimes, though, conflicts can come out of nowhere. Emotions flare, the stakes are high, and both sides are unwilling to give any ground. How do we get to a decision when no one is willing to budge? We're going to take a look at how to leverage your communication and conflict resolution skills to effectively mediate conflict. We'll also leave time for your questions and comments on the subject matter. For our program today, we have one presenter who's going to provide guidance and support while also provoking thoughts and awareness, so you walk away from today's program with new insight on the topic. At this point, I'd like to introduce our presenter. Christian Nuccio has served as the Judiciary Committee Chairman since June of this year. He graduated from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, the Eta Omega chapter, in 2010, and earned a master's degree from Marshall University in 2016. As a volunteer, Christian served as a section director, regional manager of risk management, and both Regional Chief of Staff and Chief Operating Officer until being appointed to the Judiciary Committee in 2015. He was also awarded the Fraternity Regional Manager of the Year in 2013 and the Silver Distinguished Service Award in 2014. Professionally, he served as a captain in the U.S. Army. Now to get started with the presentation, I'll hand it off to Christian.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mackenzie. I really appreciate it. So today what we're going to do is we're going to be going over conflict mediation. So conflict mediation, I'll tell you, both professionally and from the Judiciary Committee perspective, we see a lot of this. And what I want to do is I want to assist by giving just a couple of tools to help out with the conflict piece. And then at the end of the presentation, really, if there are questions, if you're having issues in your chapter when it comes to conflict management, I'd love for you to bounce them off me. What I'll say is conflict management is going to be a key, or it's going to be key when you get into your professional lives if you haven't gotten into your professional life already. Most of us are going to be business leaders, and we're going to very quickly run into problems with employees. I'll tell you, for college students, when they graduate, one of the issues you'll have almost immediately is if you take on a management position, you will work with people who are much, much older than you who will have conflicts. And you'll be working with, you might graduate and by the age of 24 be mediating a conflict between two 45-year-olds, which is a very weird position to be in. And professionally, I've been in that position a couple of times. So hopefully these tools will help iron out some of those pieces and give you a good approach to conflict mediation. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to begin by going over the agenda. So let me get this pulled up here for you. My system's just a little bit slow. So we've already gone over the introductions here. The big pieces we're going to cover are identifying interested parties, figuring out the intent of the issue, getting to the compromise, and then finally coming to an agreement. And then finally, we are going to look at revisiting an agreement, which is kind of the biggest issue that we see. So I'm going to start by going over the introduction here. Excuse me. So when it comes to what we're trying to do for conflict mediation, we want to look at the difference between business and personal disagreements. And you're going to find this is very difficult to separate when you get into the professional world, and I'm sure in your chapter. So a lot of times, I'll use an example of governance where you'll have two individuals in your chapter that believe a issue should be handled a certain way, and maybe there's some vagueness in the bylaws on how you're going to handle this issue. So if you are the chapter president or the chapter executive vice president, and your job is to kind of make these two sides come together, what you need to do is you need to look at whether or not we are having a professional issue where everybody wants what's best for the organization, or whether these two individuals actually really dislike each other and one happens to be disagreeing because they just never agree with the other person. And that doesn't change once you leave the chapter. Next is, I do want to talk about a couple of conflict trends we see in the fraternity. So they revolve around three major issues, which is removal of a pledge, brother misconduct, or personal romantic relationships. And I don't want to get too much into it because I could spend a whole webinar just talking about these three issues, so we'll talk about it at the end. But I'd ask you to keep pledge removal, brother misconduct, and personal romantic relationships in mind as we can proceed forward. The last thing I'll talk about is checking your emotions at the door. So what you're going to find is if you are the mediator of an issue, you will have the ability to remain kind of neutral and passive. The two people that are generally involved in a conflict are going to have emotions tied to whatever they're arguing about. Even if it's a purely business decision, at a certain point, people get frustrated because there's a belief that the reason you're not siding with them or you're not accepting their proposal completely is because you either don't trust them or don't believe in them, and there's going to be some personal exception to that. As the mediator, the entire tone of the conflict mediation is going to revolve around how you act. So if you get upset, they will get upset. If you remain calm, you have a much higher chance of the conflicts remaining calm. So let's go ahead forward and talk about identifying interested parties. This is the first major step to conflict mediation. So we've heard there are always two sides to every story. Usually, though, we find that there are more. So what you want to look at are who else is impacted by this ultimate decision. I'll tell you, recently I worked a case where one of the major issues inside the chapter was quorum. So the chapter was a relatively small chapter, and depending on the outcome of discipline, even suspending one member would drastically change the quorum inside the chapter and would make it so they may or may not be able to attend certain or hold certain events because of that. Something you're probably not thinking of when you're going through disciplinary hearings, but still has bearing on the outcome, not only of the case, but also how you're going to work with the chapter when the case is complete. Next piece I'll talk about is determining each party's stake in the decision. So I ask, who is worth bringing to the table for a compromise? And more importantly, who is best left out? So especially when you're looking at two separate parties, informal parties are still organizations you need to be concerned about. So if there are two groups of people generally in your chapter, there's going to be a natural leader of those groups, and those are the people you want to interact with. There are also going to be people who are on the extreme end of what you are trying to accomplish or the compromise you're trying to make. And my recommendation is, while their thoughts and their ideas are important, take a very careful approach to bringing them into the compromise discussion, because the further they are on the extreme end, the less they're willing to compromise, and the less likely you'll be able to get to a amenable solution for everyone. So next is determining who the actual decision maker is for the issue. So, and this is a huge one for business disagreements. look at your bylaws, or for a chapter, look at the policies. A lot of times, what two individuals might not believe in or might be arguing over, neither of them actually has the ability to make a decision. And you as the mediator either might be in that position or you might be the recommender for what you should do moving forward. That holds a lot of authority in discussions. I'm going to segue a little bit and talk about servant leadership. So servant leadership is a leadership style where, and the belief is that your employees are the key to success. And if you can keep your employees happy, you will always be profitable. And it's a relatively good form of leadership. The way that this conflict mediation can get involved there is a lot of times when you're trying to bring two sides together, if you're the person who can just make the final call, you can tell both sides, listen, I have the ability to just end this conversation right now. So we can either remain civil and come to an agreement, or I'll just make a decision for what I think is best, and neither of you will be happy. And while that's not exactly a happy approach to it, you'd be surprised how effective that is in getting people to realize that they need to discuss things properly and professionally with you. The last piece I'll talk about is identifying the neutral parties. So neutral parties are a great way of making sure that the decision that you're reaching has some sort of sanity check on them. And we do it a lot of times, even if you look at the way your chapter does discipline. So your chapter has a judicial review board or an executive committee that makes a decision, but then you turn it over to the chapter as a whole, and you've got this fresh set of eyes to look at it to make sure what the JRB is recommending, the chapter actually agrees with and thinks is a good idea. We'll move forward to the next slide, which is figuring out the intent. So whatever the issue is, you want to make sure that you take a deliberate approach to resolving the issue. So that either might be meetings or taking notes. Too often, issues are discussed during an emergency meeting or through mediums like texting or email. If you're really going to solve an issue, set aside a couple of hours in a private meeting place to dedicate time to resolve the problem. So, and I will tell you from the Judiciary Committee perspective, I can't tell you how many times I get an email saying, we have a problem and we just talked about it at an emergency meeting of exec. I would challenge everybody on this call to ask yourselves, when is the last time your chapter had an emergency meeting of exec? And then take that and look at successful or semi-successful governments across the country and across the world. How often do they hold special sessions? It's very, very rare. And that's because there's a very low likelihood that if you have a severe issue, calling a 1-hour meeting is going to resolve that problem. Most likely what it's going to do is going to put a Band-Aid on that problem, and by putting a Band-Aid on that problem, you're going to find other issues arise later. So I would resist the urge to call an emergency meeting unless it's absolutely necessary, and instead call a meeting with 48 hours notice. And when you sit down at that meeting, tell everybody, look, we will not come to a decision today. Today is just to gather facts. We'll set a meeting 2 days later, and that's when we'll start working on the resolution. You'd be surprised how much easier that will make your life, especially as a chapter leader, and how little it will matter in the end that it took 3 days instead of 1 day to come up with a solution. Next piece is sketching out the issue and the factors that make it important to each side. So, and I'm going to go into this on the next slide, so I'll transition over here and talk about how this works on this next slide, which is understanding the root of the issue. So whenever two parties are disagreeing, there are things that people will compromise on and things that people won't compromise on. If you're the mediator, your job is to figure out the things that people will never compromise on. Because if you spend time trying to convince them, you're just going to waste your time. So I will make an example of, let's say your chapter is caught in between getting one of two teams to sponsor your chapter, either the Red Sox or the Yankees. So you've got two camps. You've got the Red Sox camp and the Yankee camp. You need to figure out what's driving that belief. Is it because your chapter is half from Boston and half from New York? Is it because your chapter is huge baseball fans, so they're invested in the particular teams and not just the locations? What's the driving cause behind what they're looking for? And if you can get there, so if you can find out that people really don't care if they're, about the Red Sox or the Yankees, they more care about the hometown pride that they have, you've suddenly built yourself an avenue to do some negotiation here and find some compromise. The next piece is be prepared to lose ground. So compromise means both parties are both going to be satisfied and they're going to be dissatisfied. So talks often break down when one side suddenly realizes that they're losing ground. An agreement is not finished until it's been completely signed. So there's no point in walking away early on these conversations. I'll compare. I'll look at the Israel-Palestine conflict that you see over in the Middle East area. Very often those conflicts break down because one of the sides, they've gone through compromising steps, and one of the sides realizes that they've compromised, and the other side is now saying they're unwilling to compromise. So what that looks like is, I'm giving something up, and you're not giving anything up, so I'm going to lose, and they walk away from the talks. If you're the mediator and you find that conversation occurring where one side isn't going to give up anything, take a break, come back, and then address a separate issue and come back to that. Give it some time to kind of resolve. The last piece here is going to be ask yourself what can be sacrificed to meet the end goal. So this is kind of a concept called mea culpa, which is when you enter into an agreement, you should be immediately willing to lose something. So when you walk into a car negotiation, you tell them, look, I'm willing to spend $20,000 on this car, and you already know you're willing to spend $25,000. So the first time he comes back, you say, I'll meet you halfway and I'll do $22,000. That piece, you already knew that you were willing to go up to $22,000 with no problem. That's mea culpa. That's when you say, that's ground you were willing to give up at the beginning. Understand the other side has ground they're willing to give up in the beginning as well. And so you both are going to kind of go through this process of giving up ground until you really get to the meat of the issue. So the next slide goes over coming to an agreement, and this will be the piece that takes the longest. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk about the major chapter issues. So I'm going to talk about relationships between pledges and brothers, and I'm going to talk about conflicts with brothers and removal of pledges. So I'll start with removal of pledges. First, I want to make sure everybody understands that there are two separate ways that we work with pledges when it comes to negative action. So the first way is discipline. So when you discipline a pledge, the process is the exact same as when you discipline a brother. You go through a hearing, you call a JRB or an executive committee, and they go through and they decide how they're going to punish the pledge. That is a matter of discipline. There's a separate matter that is removing a pledge. And when you remove a pledge, there's no hearing. The pledge doesn't have the opportunity to defend themselves because it's not about whether or not the pledge did anything wrong. It's just a vote for admission into the organization. The chapter just holds a single vote, and if the vote is unfavorable, the pledge is removed from the process. I see a significant amount of conflict in the fraternity sees a significant amount of conflict when it comes to decisive votes to remove people. So as a chapter leader, you know when this is going to come up. You know when a pledge is, kind of on the fence on whether or not people like them, or sometimes they just have very grating personalities, or they've done something that you might, or your chapter might consider to be offensive. And so as the chapter leader, going into the meeting, 50% of this room is not going to be happy with the outcome of this meeting. So when you go in, what you should look at is, can I find this middle ground? So we're talking right now about coming to an agreement. And for the chapter leader, you're going to have to kind of be willing to make some decisions on whether or not you're willing to support keeping the individual in or taking them out. And part of this is going to be giving everybody a chance to speak on the floor. When you're giving everybody a chance to speak on the floor, when you're trying to come to an agreement, you need to make sure that everybody is in control and they're addressing the specific issue. So I will give an example. An example is you've got a pledge, and the pledge may or may not have said something offensive to another pledge. Now, that's a matter of discipline. And if the chapter hasn't held a hearing and they haven't gone through to determine whether or not there is fault here, it's not very appropriate to use hearsay as a method to remove a pledge. So as the chapter president or officer, your job should be to control that conversation and remind them, Whenever somebody starts deviating off path, you remind them that when we remove a pledge, we are looking at the whole of the person and their actions throughout the pledge process. And so you're constantly steering that conversation back to what you are attempting to do. So that's an example of removing a pledge and kind of where you can go with that. I'll give you some ideas for compromise. Very often for compromise, I've seen the ability to write a very strict pledge action plan that has an option for removal if the pledge fails or fails to do something again. So this is usually earlier in the pledge process, and that's a great way to meet that compromise, which is letting everybody know, essentially, we're going to give this pledge one more chance, and if they fail, they're removed from the process. Another way to compromise is to recommend a disciplinary hearing instead. So if one side of the room is hell-bent on bringing up what this pledge did, perhaps the best way to handle it is to hold a disciplinary hearing and figure out whether or not they actually did that. And then as part of the disciplinary recommendations, it'll come back to the chapter, and the chapter can make a decision based on what occurred. The second piece I'm going to talk about, and I don't want to go on forever about this, I'm willing to answer questions offline if you want me to, is about pledge brother relationships. At the Judiciary Committee, we are very quickly working on a policy paper that talks about the Alpha Kappa Psi policies when it comes to brother and pledge relationships. And I'll make it simple, which is there is no fraternity policy on that. Brothers and pledges are Americans or in some cases Chinese or UK individuals. They are free to interact with people in legal consensual ways however they want to, and far be it for the fraternity to tell them that they shouldn't be able to do that. Now, recognizing that, I know there are a lot of chapters out there that have these policies that say pledges and brothers can't date or can't be intimately involved, and I don't work with creating policy, so what we're doing is creating a recommendation for if you want to have a policy like that in place, we can help you with a conflict of interest policy. And a conflict of interest policy simply states that we believe the root of the cause, and this is, we'll tie it back to compromise, the root of the cause of why you have this policy is to prevent pledges from being treated unfairly, whether it comes to divulging secrets to them or getting them brought into the fraternity because they're dating somebody who can cast a vote, or protecting them from sexual harassment. I think the root of why we have these policies in place is to protect the pledge. And so because of that, a conflict of interest policy allows brothers and pledges to come to a confidential member of the organization and make them aware that we are engaged in a conflict of interest, where the brother has the ability to remove a pledge, and because they have the ability to remove a pledge, they have some power over this individual that could create some problems later. By simply notifying the chapter or a chapter representative of that, and then creating some simple guidelines, things like, look, if there's a conflict of interest, then they shouldn't be big and little. Or if there's a conflict of interest, we recommend that the brother abstain from voting on the individual. Those small steps are a compromise to the two camps, which are everybody should be able to date whoever they want to, and pledges should never be able to date brothers ever. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I've been engaged over the past 3 months in a significant amount of debate over how we're going to meet this middle ground between these two camps. And while we're coming up with a solution right now, I'd recommend inside your chapter, you kind of do the same thing. Start looking at your policy and asking yourself, is the policy that we have really effective? Is the way that we want to prevent sexual harassment just making everybody abstain from sex? Is that the best way to do this? And if you don't think it's the best way to do this, reach out to the Judiciary Committee or your chapter advisor and ask them, hey, we're looking at doing this a little differently. What recommendations do you have? And if it comes after my date on the wall is December 18th, hopefully they'll have a policy paper to show you that says this might be the best way to do it. And again, I can talk offline about that. Today I want to focus on the conflict mediation piece, but if you have additional questions, feel free to bring them up, and I'm more than happy to answer them. The last piece I'm going to talk about here is how to get to that agreement. So I brought up 2 examples of problems that we have, and I'll tell you the biggest flaw I see when we resolve these issues is that we don't put them in writing. So the chapter will hold a meeting, and everybody will discuss and come up with a solution, and your Vice President of Administration will take notes, and as minutes usually go, they'll be in shorthand, and they'll say something like, Brother X agrees with Brother Y that we will do this. That is not enough when another conflict comes up later and you have to look back on what you originally agreed on. So I always recommend, and what I recommend your chapter, is they issue a statement. So two people work together on something that looks like a problem statement, except it's more like a solution statement, which is a 5 or 6 sentence paragraph that says, this was the problem, this is the solution we've come up with, and this is when we intend to readdress this issue to make sure that we're on the right path. So if you come up with a conflict of interest policy, what you would say is, we had a policy in our chapter that forbid people from engaging in relationships, and we wanted to make sure that people were still free to do what they wanted while being protected. We came up with a solution that was to create a conflict of interest policy that goes over, has these parameters in it. We will readdress this April 1st, 2017 to see if the policy has been effective and whether or not it needs to be modified. So you make that statement, you stick it in the minutes. You've tied a specific date to when you're going to readdress it, which I'm going to flip to the next slide because we're going to talk about that. So you've tied a specific date to when you're going to readdress it. You've already written the problem in, which is great because people now have some historical context of what went on in case your chapter leadership transitions out. And you've written in the exact solution that you want to make. So if you're doing this and you're putting it in your bylaws, you write in the exact text you intend to put in the bylaws. And so now you've got the historical record, you've got the past, the present, and how you're going to address it in the future. And then once we look at this revisiting the agreement, like I said before, that firm date is really going to be how we make sure that we're following up with what we said. I can't tell you how often I struggle with chapters who come to the Judiciary Committee because they basically tabled a discussion and didn't put a date on that discussion. And now they're calling us or they're calling their chapter advisor because that problem has to be resolved by court of honor, which is tomorrow. And they need an answer right now. And that's because somebody in the chapter didn't put some milestones together. So I'd ask you as chapter leaders, you have some major event coming up, right? Maybe you have a retreat coming up or a major banquet. Have you put together 3 or 4 milestone dates when you plan to meet before that so you know that you're on track and you're not scrambling at the last second? Have you assigned due dates to all of the requirements that you have to get there? If you haven't done that, I'll tell you that you're going to run into some struggles inevitably, maybe not this semester, but eventually you'll run into struggles. And similarly, if you resolve a conflict and you don't put some dates on when you intend to readdress it to make sure it's working, one side is eventually not going to appreciate this compromise anymore, and they're going to get upset. And they have no venue to discuss it because there's no date on the wall to do so. So following up with that date is really, really important. And then the other piece we're going to talk about is the modification piece. So nobody should ever be locked into an agreement so much that they're unwilling to change if they're presented with data that says it isn't working. So your conflict of interest policy, let's say that's the piece we're going to talk about right now. So you get to your date, and what you find is that nobody's reporting this conflict of interest anymore because the policy is too vague or something like that. Okay, well, if that's the case, and you're faced with data that shows you that 0 people have reported a conflict of interest, and you know they exist, then the policy isn't working. So both sides need to agree that the compromise they came to is not effective, and they need to re-enter into a negotiation. Even though one side feels like they won here, they're never going to actually win this argument unless the other side has bought into the solution. So what I would say is, if you are involved in mediating conflict or if you are a party of conflict, the first thing you should look at is data to ask, hey, is what we're doing actually have a measurable outcome, and is that measurable outcome in our favor or not? And if it is not, have the courage to admit that even though I came out on top in this compromise, it's not making you happy, so I'm willing to make some adjustments so that we can keep the other side happy. So let's get to the takeaways part. Basically what we've covered is how to go through and compromise on an issue. So what you want to do is you want to start by identifying who's involved, identify the root cause of the problem that you're dealing with, and what people are completely unwilling to change on, and then work through those pieces that they are willing to kind of give ground on until you eventually get to a solution where everybody's both happy and unhappy with the outcome. Nobody should ever leave a compromise feeling excited about the fact that their party came out on top, because by doing that, the other party obviously didn't. So both pieces need to, or both sides need to give a little bit of ground and still gain something in return on the pieces they were unwilling to waver on. There is always going to be a middle ground, even in the most polar issues. And I would argue that if anybody in this room could bring up the most polar issue they can think of, I promise you there's a middle ground. The difference, even if we talk about global problems, if we talk about Israel and Palestine, if we talk about the death penalty or abortion, there's a middle ground. The problem is that people have not identified what is so critical they won't give up, and what is not as critical and they're willing to give up because they really want to get to that compromise. Determining the root cause can make the compromise much faster and easier. And then the last piece is what can be sacrificed to meet the end goal. So if you're on either side of the table, or you're the mediator in the middle, you need to ask people, would you be willing to give that up if we could get to a solution here? And you might get no at first, but you'd be surprised how much people are willing to give up to bring an issue finally to an end so they can focus on other things.
All right, thank you, Christian. That was actually a lot of really good information and is going to wrap up the content portion of today's program. So now it's time that we want to hear from all you guys listening in. As stated earlier, you can launch the Q&A widget from the menu dock to submit your questions. This feature will remain open even in on-demand viewing, and if we do not get to your question, we will respond via email. At this time, we're going to go ahead and start with the first question we have here, and that's, what would you recommend in cases where there's a problem, but people are unwilling to address it publicly or formally?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I don't have a lot of information on what the issue is you're talking about, so I'll try to keep it general. It's going to take some courageous leadership from chapter officers. I'm assuming a large portion of who's on the call is chapter officers. But you can't allow these problems to fester. I would say a lot of, maybe on the chapter side, what I see when it comes to this is a lot of brother on brother issues where there are two people who just really cannot stand each other, and it's fomenting a lot of problems in the chapter. And what it takes is a courageous leader to pull those two off to the side and let them know, hey, what you're doing is impacting everybody around you. And we need to come to a solution on it because it's ruining the chapter culture here. So that's not a great answer, because that's an obvious answer, which is having somebody tell everybody what the problem is. Maybe if I could give a better answer, it would be to start off slow. So it might be, to start off slow might just be letting each individual know separately, I've noticed you've had a problem with the other individual, and I'm here to work with you if you'd like to make it better. And then as things get more and more heated, go back to those individuals and let them know, look, if this continues, I'm going to force a meeting because it's becoming public at this point. And I was trying to keep it private, but it's getting too far. And then once it gets to a point where it becomes public, you now have the ability to tell them, look, it's become public, and as a chapter officer, I have a responsibility to address it. So this is the meeting time. I need you both to be there. Maybe that will help come to a solution there.
Great answer. Next question we have here is, how should you handle a situation where the person says they're going to comply and they agree to a time to meet, but then they just don't change their behavior?
Okay. This is a much more difficult question to answer, and it really depends on if we're talking about personal issues or business issues. What I would say is that there comes a time when the chapter, or professionally when you are going to have to take action. And as a leader, you're going to have to figure out where that line is. So there are going to be times when you have to tell an individual, look, we have to come to a solution within the next week, or I'm going to have to terminate you because I can't keep working with you on this. Or at your chapter, it's going to be, look, we have to come to a resolution the next week, or we're going to bring you up on disciplinary charges because you cannot conduct yourself as a brother should be conducting themselves. And while you don't want to use a threat as a way to force a meeting, I do think it's very important to be honest with people and to let them know that you are completely willing to take action. Again, I'll refer back to a case I ran recently on the Judiciary Committee where a chapter was having a couple of problems, and generally it doesn't come to me until I start running the case, but it came to me a little early. And I emailed the chapter and I let them know, look, you can resolve this at your level, but if you don't resolve it by this date, I will be forced to open investigation on your chapter because it was very close to a ritual they were performing. And I notified the chapter very early on, if we get to this date and you haven't resolved it, I will open an investigation. And for me, that's not a threat. That's just the fact of life. I have to do it. I'm required to. And that date came and nothing had been resolved, and I stuck to my guns and opened the investigation because I have to follow through on my word here. I would argue it's the exact same thing for you as a chapter officer, to let people know it's nothing personal, but I have to take a stand at some point, and I'm giving you a date on when I'm going to take a stand. So just work with me and let's get it resolved so we don't have to let it get that far. And then the second piece of that is follow through on what you're saying. If you tell somebody, listen, on this date, if it doesn't get done, we're going to have a problem needs to happen on that date, because if not, every other time you try to invoke an issue or you try to recommend to somebody that they get something done by a certain time period, you're not going to be able to back it up because you've already shown once that you can't follow through on your actions there.
Great answer. All right, next question we have here is, how do officers correct other officers?
Okay, that is a really good question. Okay, so let's look at it from two perspectives, right? Let's look at it from discipline, and let's look at it from the compromising side. I'm going to start with compromising first. So executive committee is obviously the most powerful committee in your chapter. It is also a great way to interact with people because you can go into closed session. When you go into closed session, you can kind of brawl it out right there in the room. The chapter president, who is supposed to remain neutral, should remain neutral, and you should kind of let people go at it. Obviously, don't let it get out of control, but people need to be able to express exactly how they feel in what is now being colloquially referred to as a safe space. So they need to be able to talk in a place where they know, hey, when this conversation ends, the contents of it don't leave the room. And I would argue sometimes your chapter is going to fight about, hey, when this conversation ends, the contents of this are going to leave the room and we need to be able to trust each other. But you should still be able to have that discussion. Addressing it outright and frankly with the individual, especially if you have the support of your peers. So if you have one chapter officer that's really not pulling their weight, it almost helps to go at it kind of intervention style where it's not just you telling them, it's 3 or 4 individuals sitting down and just saying, look, we've noticed you've had a problem and we're not attacking you, we just want to help you. So are there responsibilities you would like us to get to so you can focus on other things? Kind of that's that mea culpa piece where you're not telling them, look, you're totally messed up and you need to fix yourself. Instead, you're saying, hey, maybe it's us. Maybe we're not helping you enough. What can we do to help you better? From the discipline perspective, your chapter officers are duly elected and they represent the chapter. And the chapter officers in your chapter need to know that their actions can have a severe impact on chapter operations and how they're viewed within the fraternity. So there should be a very low tolerance for when chapter members or chapter officers are not performing or they're not complying with disciplinary requirements. There should be a lower tolerance on how we're going to resolve that issue. I'm sure you all know that there are a couple of things you can do in your chapter. The easiest way to do it is a vote of no confidence, which I believe takes a 75% threshold to remove them. I would argue that even if we look at the British parliamentary system, occasionally votes of no confidence are held, and they are held with the knowledge that they will lose the vote of no confidence. But they're doing it to show just how much dissent there is right now on the individual's performance. Now, I don't think a public flaying of your chapter officers is a good idea. I do think a chapter officer letting another chapter officer know that if they don't perform better, there's a chance that this vote of no confidence could be called. I do think that is a very good approach because it's better to know that than to get suddenly surprised by it when you walk into a chapter meeting. I think you kind of have responsibility as executive officers to work with each other to make sure everybody gets better. So sorry I went on a little bit longer, but I see it a lot, and I'm glad somebody asked that question.
Great. Next question that we have here is, what suggested repercussions do you suggest for a JRB to utilize for offenses that don't yet require suspension?
That is an awesome question, and I will tell you that even I have struggled with answering this question. Not that I'm high and mighty or anything, but it's just I see it a lot, and it's very hard to answer. Here are some recommendations I have. So community service and fines, those are always the two that people go to. And what I would say is community service and fines are punitive in nature. So the idea is you're sucking up people's time or money to punish them for what they've done, which is kind of the equivalent to what the U.S. does, which is either you go to prison or you have to pay a fine. What that does is, while it punishes the individual, it doesn't really do a lot to rehabilitate them. So I would look at some rehabilitative options. A couple of options I would look at is, you don't want to publicly embarrass the person, but there are opportunities for them to give presentations to the chapter. So if the individual had difficulty or failed to comply with the risk management policy, maybe it would be best if the individual sat down and talked to the chapter about, hey, here are the struggles I have with the risk management policy, and here are ways we can all comply with them. You can also force the brother onto a certain committee that deals with an issue that's related to the problem. So let's say that the brother acted improperly. So we look at that gross improper conduct. So by punishing that individual, you put them on the professional committee. And what you do is you have them talk about workplace disputes, or you have them talk about how to interact in an interview. And what you're doing is you're building the chapter up, but you're also having this person introspectively focus on, hey, what could I do to be better here? So those are a couple of, you've got the community service, you've got the fines, you've also got giving presentations, putting them on committees and giving them specific tasks, or having them work with specific officers. So, people who don't pay their fines and they have to go on financial suspension, when they come back, why don't you put them under the fundraising chair and give them the ability to work with the fundraising chair to come up with some novel fundraising ideas? They're personally invested in it. They don't want to not meet their threshold again for financial dues, so they're personally invested in making the chapter better by improving their own quality of life.
Really good answer. Next question we have is, what do you do when you have to confront someone who's either older than you or in a higher position than you?
This is a very awkward situation to deal with. I've been fortunate that I haven't had to do it a lot in the past, so I don't have a lot of recommendations. Here's what I can tell you. You want to look for the person who has the best access to that individual. So if you are having a problem with the chapter president, instead of confronting them directly, maybe it's better to pull the executive vice president or the MOR off to the side and let them know, listen, here's the problem I'm having. I can talk to the president directly about it, or maybe you could talk to them for me and kind of make it a little bit better. I know you're not going to be able to have the same effectiveness as me, but maybe we can kind of get to a middle ground here. So looking for an access source is a great way to address somebody that's higher than you. The other thing I would recommend doing is putting your complaint in writing. So a lot of times when you verbally interact with somebody, it gets emotional very quickly. No matter what, when you tell somebody they're doing something wrong, human nature is to get defensive over it. So if you write it instead, what you've done is you've basically prepared a statement that they can't cut you off mid-sentence and interrupt you on because they have to read through the whole document before responding. If you're going to do that, you should start with a mea culpa, just like we've talked about in this compromise conversation. So you should talk about saying something like, hey, dear chapter president, I can't see things from your perspective. So I know you're under a lot of stress, but this particular action you've done recently has had a negative impact on me, and I want to explain to you why. So what you did is you started by lowering yourself and saying, look, I don't know where you are, and I'm sure you didn't mean for this to be bad, but something bad happened, and here's what I'd like you to do to resolve it. By starting off on a soft note, you have a great chance of them reading the document. You have a great chance of them responding to you in writing, which is incredibly powerful because what people put in writing is binding. And people are very careful with the words they use when they put it in writing as opposed to saying it to your face. And by having written dialogue, you have a much better chance of coming to a middle ground and a solution than just having verbal agreements with things. So that was a little disjointed, sorry, but a couple of ideas that you could do, having either the access source or addressing the issue in writing, that might make it a little bit better.
I think that's a great answer there. Next question we have is, how do you handle a situation when the other person will not even agree to discussion?
It depends on the severity of the issue. So sometimes it's better to not address issues. Not all the time, but sometimes, okay, here's an example. Perhaps your chapter is experiencing it. Actually, I experienced it. So when I pledged Alpha Kappa Psi, we were assigned a big brother just like everybody else. I was recruited by my best friend who brought me into the organization, but my best friend had a leadership position and wasn't allowed to have a little as per the rules of our chapter. So instead, the chapter assigned me his girlfriend. About halfway through the pledge process, they broke up in a very messy breakup. And what happened to me is I was stuck between my big brother and my best friend, who, I was kind of beholden to both of them as they both went through this issue. What I'll say is that there is no chance that Alpha Kappa Psi or the Eta Omega chapter could have ever resolved this dispute. Couldn't happen. There's no way bringing these two to the table would have made it better. So it's better instead for the chapter to kind of quarantine it. So if you've got somebody who is refusing to come to the table, it's best to just go address them and let them know, look, here are your parameters. Here are the walls I'm going to build around you. I've got no problem with you absolutely hating this person, or I've got no problem with you refusing to discuss this issue. But I won't have it happen in chapter meetings or at chapter events. And if you make a scene, you'll be held accountable for making a scene. So what you're doing here is you're not addressing the issue, which isn't the best way to do it. But you are preventing problems from getting worse, which in the end does help the chapter out a little bit. So I'd recommend, if you're in that situation, kind of take a quarantine approach to letting the individual know, look, I'm not going to push the issue on you, but I'm also not going to let it affect anybody around you. And you'll be held to consequences if you do, but it's best if we just find that line and define it very well so you know when you are crossing it and when you're not.
Good. All right, the next question that we have here is, how can a chapter make a disciplinary action during a break in semesters?
Oh, man, that is a good question. Okay, so how can a chapter make a disciplinary action? So well, quickly, this is a little more risk management, but I'm happy to address it. As Mackenzie knows, I very much like risk management. So let's look at chapter disciplinary procedures. So chapter disciplinary seizures. You must notify the individual in writing, both via email and certified mail, within 7 days of their hearing. So that hearing is going to have to take place at least 7 days before. So maybe let's say the person committed an infraction today. Today is the 6th. So 7 days from today, arguably you want to give yourself a little padding. So let's say 7 days from tonight, so we consider that the 7th, is going to be the 14th. So on the 14th, you'd be able to hold your hearing. So you hold your hearing. Now, after you make a decision, the chapter is going to have to decide on the issue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer your question in terms of what the rules are, and then I'm going to answer your question in terms of what best practice is. So the rules are that your chapter only needs quorum to hold a meeting, which is going to be 50% plus one of your chapter. Once your chapter has done that, actually, while we're talking, let me look this up. But once your chapter has done that, I believe you need 75% of the chapter. You only need 50%. You only need a majority for non-suspension or expulsion issues, and you'll need 75% for suspension or expulsion. So I'm going to look up real quick if the requirement is 75% present in good standing or 75% in good standing. I'll get there. But anyway, your chapter is going to have to make a decision. So to answer your question, you can hold an emergency session. I would strongly recommend that you don't, just like I have spoken about it in this compromise meeting, where calling an emergency session always leads to problems. So what I would recommend for your chapter is, even though you want to resolve this issue right now, I would recommend that instead you focus on how you're going to resolve it right when you get back. So perhaps what you do is you hold Judiciary Committee hearing this week or in the near future, because that only takes 3 or 4 people. And then the first order of business, the first meeting you come back, is the decision on that vote. Maybe that's a good way to do it. The other thing you can look at is, and I might open a can of worms by saying this, but the chapter has the ability to petition to temporarily suspend the individual. The chapter can't temporarily suspend anybody. You have to have a full process. But sometimes there's such a threat because of, let's say, like a sexual harassment or sexual assault claim, or somebody's gotten a restraining order against somebody else. So there's such a threat that you can't have this person coming to meetings because it's just too dangerous. You should send an email to Brian Parker at the Heritage Center, give him an idea of what the situation is, and then we can make a petition to see if the individual can be temporarily suspended. It doesn't always work. As a chapter advocate, I will be the first one to ask every single time, but I will be very upfront and frank with you to let you know, hey, this might work, or there's no chance this is going to go through. I'll do it anyway, but it's not going to go through. So I'll be upfront with you. Hopefully that answered your question, which is you can call an emergency session, but instead I'd recommend you do the JRB hearing this semester, and you do the chapter meeting the first session the semester you get back. My computer's not complying right now, so I'll see if I can get a good answer for you on the present in good standing.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. This is going to be the last question for the night, and that's, at what point do you involve someone else in the conversation?
Okay, so at what point do you involve somebody else in the conversation? All right. I guess what we're looking at here is whether we're talking about involving somebody, whether we're looking at involving somebody inside the chapter or outside the chapter. So I would argue that if we are talking about somebody, if you're talking about bringing somebody in inside the chapter, earlier is probably better. And I would say earlier is better because the earlier you can bring in more parties, the less they have to get kind of spun up on what's going on here. If we're talking about external, so we're talking about, hey, when should I bring somebody outside the organization because nobody in here can possibly be neutral. I would say you should exhaust all the options possible before bringing somebody external. And that is because I have generally found that an external party gives a compromise and doesn't understand the impact, long-term impact it's going to have on the culture, because once they make that decision, they get to leave. So they don't have to deal with the fallout that happens 2 or 3 years later. That's not always a bad thing, because sometimes they can come to some very logical conclusions without thinking about feelings. But sometimes it's good to have some context there. So I would argue, look, when you've hit when you hit a number of brick walls and you don't think you're going to get anywhere, external party is great. Internally, the first resistance you get, you should ask yourself, look, is this resistance happening because these people are never going to get along, or is this resistance happening because I might not be the right person for the job? And just bring in a neutral party and see. So I'm going to answer that question very quickly before we get off. Let me just say, for an investigation, it takes 75% of the chapter present at the meeting and in good standing. That means if you were to hold an emergency session, and you should check the bylaws before. I'm looking at a different document. You should check the board director statement of policy. It's actually the Constitution and statutory code before you make this decision. But if this information is correct, you would be able to hold an emergency meeting with 50% plus 1 of your membership to meet quorum, and then 75% of those members would have to vote to invoke suspension, or 50% to conduct discipline. So hopefully that answers your question. Whoever asked that question, email me after this, and I'll help you out with it.
All right. Thank you, Christian. That is going to be all the time that we have for today. So I want to thank all of our participants and callers for all you guys' great questions and comments. As Christian noted, for any follow-up questions or conversation, feel free to contact him using the information provided on the screen. And also mention the Q&A widget will also remain open after the live webinar has ended. I would like to thank Christian again for his great insight and expertise today. Finally, there are upcoming programs listed on the aksci.org website, including upcoming webinars and new e-learnings that are available for you to watch. Continue to check out the website and our social media as we add new resources available to you. If you have any suggestions for future topics, please send them to education@aksci.org. Again, thank you to our presenter, and thank you for joining us today.